In 2024, we have foldable phones and cars that can drive themselves. Yet, we don't have the technology that lets you stream Spotify while swimming underwater. My boyfriend is big on swimming, and once he mentioned that he would like to get headphones to listen to music when he swims. I thought, how hard could that be?
And I said, well, how hard can it be? Boys do it.
So I went online and I read a couple of news outlets that would compare which headphones are better and which are worth your money. Yet none of them seemed what I need. All of those companies seem to be selling me 20-year-old tech, which is like, download your MP3 files onto SD card and then put your SD card in your headphones, and only then you can listen to music. There's no streaming, there's no choosing when you want to stream at any given moment. However, that was a common frustration among everyone who's looking for the same thing. There is just no capacity for us to currently stream Spotify underwater. And the problem is much deeper than just tech companies. The problem is how underwater wireless works, or doesn't work. Underwater wireless communication is extremely important for military applications, for marine biologists and environmentalists to keep track of the deep ocean, migration patterns of different fish, coral reef studies, oil spills, and more. It's important for divers to explore the ocean and be connected to some kind of communication link. It's much more convenient to do with wireless technologies than with cables, as you can imagine. It's also giving it much more flexibility, because when we're sending some underwater vehicles, like small submarines or remotely operated vehicles, it's much easier for them not to have that long cable. It's just easier to go wireless. In usual terrestrial communications, we primarily use radio waves, or radio frequency waves, RF for short. Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are all examples of that. On Earth, we have different frequency bands that we divide for different purposes. Wi-Fi has some frequencies that it works on, Bluetooth has others. A great example of that is the map behind my back, actually. It shows United States frequency allocation spectrum so that one application does not interfere with each other. As we can see, it's pretty full. There's a lot of different types of things we can do with them. So they're very versatile, and they have come a long way. However, when you're trying to apply radio frequency communications underwater, they don't work very well, at all. The main factor that comes into play here is water salinity, because seawater is a good conductor for the type of frequency that we use for terrestrial communications. Saltwater ions come in contact very closely with the waves we're trying to propagate. Because of that, the waves we're sending very quickly lose all of their power. Turns out it doesn't happen as much if we send a low frequency wave, like you can see here. But as you can also see here, there's not that many applications that use such waves. There's many more applications that use high frequency waves, because high frequency waves give us much more bandwidth. There's so much more data that we can send in the one wave. The kinds of frequencies we use underwater for radio frequency communications are from 3 kilohertz to around 30 kilohertz. And you can see it's maritime and radio navigation frequencies. However, they're really, really slow. You can only send maybe textual commands, some data that really is not time sensitive, but again, it's not great. The main factors of attenuation underwater are frequency. So the higher the frequency, the higher the attenuation. Another one is water conductivity. And water conductivity is pretty much impacted by water salinity. Freshwater conductivity could be on an order of 0.01 or even a magnitude lower than that. However, when we look at seawater conductivity, because of just so much more saltwater ions that it contains, the conductivity level of it is 2 to 3 magnitudes higher. RF communications also highly suffer from Doppler effect, which is a phenomena that adjusts the frequency of the wave based on relative velocity of transmitter or receiver. So if you're sending your signal from one point and your transmitter or receiver is moving, then your signal will also change their frequency, which is not what you want to reliably decode it. If you're trying to reliably decode such signals, you need some other mechanisms that would tell you that this is the actual signal that was sent, not the modified one. And for that, there's quite a lot of different techniques, but for employing it underwater, it's usually costly, and if you can avoid that, you would want to avoid that. So that's why, even if RF has some promise to be used on low frequency data, it actually doesn't have it as much if you account for Doppler effect. Despite being used in naval or environmental applications, RF signals also need to have huge antennas to produce them. Moreover, they need to be properly encapsulated for the water not to reach into them and just make it unusable. One advantage that RF signal has is that it can propagate through air-water boundary, which is significant because other channels cannot. RF communications can also propagate through seabed in shallow water. It is helpful because when it propagates through the seabed, there is a bigger power than it can output. So it can create multiple paths in which RF signal will travel, and then if we are able to capture both of those signals and recombine them at the receiver, we can achieve a much greater power to the signal than it would have been on its own. Driven by the need for higher bandwidth and data rates, researchers have turned to a different kind of spectrum of electromagnetic waves: optical spectrum. Optical spectrum waves are anywhere from 300 GHz to 10 to the 15 Hz. One big difference optical communications have from RF communications is that water stops being a conductor and becomes a dielectric. This switch happens around 250 GHz, which is still lower than what optical usually is. What it means is that the frequency of the waves is so high that ions don't have time to react anymore, so they don't scatter the signal as much as they do the RF signal, which is a big plus for us because the attenuation of optical signal is not that high. One advantage that optical communications do have is that they don't suffer from Doppler spread, which was a big deal for RF communications. The speed of light underwater is around 2.25 10 to the 8th meter per second, which is lower than the speed of light in vacuum, which is 3 10 to the 8th meter per second, but it is a very high speed. And so if you compare all the other speeds, like submarines and ships, they have a much lower speed, so in relativity to the speed of communications, it's not a big deal. So we can claim that Doppler effect here is negligible. One important factor to consider is that not all kinds of optical signals propagate equally. Turns out that the effective transmission distance of optical signals heavily depends on the frequency range that they're in. Blue-green channels attenuate least due to the lower scattering and absorption in this range, which is why they can propagate furthest, and those are the signals that are primarily used. The propagation of light in optical systems underwater really depends on two things: inherent properties, which really depends on water, and this is the biggest one here, and apparent optical principles, such as what kind of laser are you using, what kind of light are you shining, those things. And because we do know how to do just lasers and light in terrestrial environments, here we primarily focus on the environment, the water. And the two main mechanisms that are happening is absorption and scattering. So those are the ones that are really impeding our optical communications underwater. Absorption really occurs at any elements you can find in water. Water molecules, phytoplankton, other tiny molecular things that are swimming in water, just dissolved organic matter, All of that creates absorption of optical signal and turning it into heat. Now, scattering changes the direction in which the photons are traveling. When a light beam hits something, its photons can hit other molecules, which will cause scattering. There are different kinds of scattering too. One of them is Rayleigh scattering. Rayleigh scattering is actually why the sky is blue. When you have tiny, tiny particles that are much smaller than your wavelengths, those particles would follow Rayleigh scattering and just scatter in all possible directions, sort of equally. However, when you have much larger things like fish, you would have Mia scattering, which is for bigger particles. And Mia scattering is much more non-uniform. So for Mia scattering, you would flow mostly in one direction, not so much in other directions. In addition to scattering and absorption, researchers also employ a backscattering coefficient. When you're as a transmitter, you're trying to send some light back to yourself to see how well did you do, how well does it look like. And this is what really helps in understanding how to tune your channel. If the light you receive back to yourself is pretty bad, the signal is not it, you probably want to crank up your power, the power of the signal you're sending, or change some other coefficients. Turns out, for optical signals, another thing, because you need to see the signals, is how clean is the water. And that directly stems from absorption and scattering into particles. So you want your water to be as clean as possible with the least amount of particles to scatter or absorb your signal. Researchers define a couple of types of water, also depending on different locations on Earth. Turns out the Pacific Ocean tends to have clear water in open regions because it doesn't have as much sediments or biological particles. However, in coastal areas like Atlantic Ocean or Indian Ocean, you would have a much higher turbidity due to dense populations, river outflows, or just industrial activities. Nutrient-rich zones, such as the coast of South America, usually have a much higher particle concentration, which impacts both scattering and absorption. Researchers specify a couple of types of water, such as pure seawater, where attenuation loss is mostly due to absorption. Clean ocean water, where scattering coefficient is higher due to more particles in the water. Coastal ocean water with much higher particle coefficients and scattering coefficients. And finally, turbid harbor. In turbid harbor, all of those things matter a lot. There is so much scattering and so much absorption that it's very, very hard to create a reliable optical signals. The way we make optical communications work underwater really depends on the components we use to create those signals. At both the transmitter and receiver end, we have specific equipment tailored to meet the needs of the link you're establishing. At the transmitter end, to generate a reliable optical signal, you need three things. First is a reliable optical signal, which could be laser or an LED, and there could be different lasers used on the kind of applications you're using, the kind of water environment you have, and other things. Second is a projection system that would be able to navigate your light to wherever you want it to go. And the third thing is beam steering, which helps you guide your light in the way of your receiver. On the receiver end, you want two main things. You want collection optics, which could be a lens or an array of lenses. Ideally, you want this lens to have quite a wide range of apertures it can reach.
And the second thing is a photosensor.
An ideal photosensor would be small, cheap, robust, but also power efficient, because you don't want to change your power too often when you're at the bottom of the ocean. At the current state of technology, we don't really have the sensors that would meet all of those needs, which is why for different applications and for different purposes, we have different sensors. Despite having so many challenges, there are still lots to tackle in this domain. Underwater optical communications are crucial today for many applications. The main advantage they provide is that they can offer high data rate and high bandwidth communications on around tens of meters. They're very important for maritime exploration of deep sea, for naval, and for commercial applications, for underwater wireless sensor networks, where we just measure different activities of fish, of just the environment, coral reefs with different sensors. and for sending submarines, and for submarines to communicate back to the ship it was sent from, for sending divers, and other things like that. Today, acoustic communications remain the main mode for underwater wireless communications because they can propagate up to 100 kilometers with very low attenuation and can penetrate the deep sea. The way we generate a sound wave is by using a transducer, a device that can convert electrical signals into sound waves. And the way we catch them is by using hydrophones that can convert acoustic sounds back into electrical signals that we can decode. One main application of acoustic signals is for submarines, because while submerged, they don't have to re-emerge back to send any data they have. An important communication link for acoustic communications underwater are sonobuoys. Sonobuoys are small floating platforms on the surface of the ocean that can propagate both RF signals and acoustic signals. The way they work is some part of them is under the water that has hydrophones, the ones that can detect acoustic signals. Those acoustic signals are then transformed into electrical ones, and the electrical signal is sent through the top part, the one that is floating above the water. And that part can be sent to ship, aircraft vessels, or terrestrial stations. An important natural phenomenon that really helps us to have great acoustic communications underwater is SOFAR. SOFAR is sound fixing and ranging channel that is created by certain conditions underwater, such as salinity, temperature, and pressure that all have to be right for the acoustic signal to propagate very far. By using acoustic communications, we can detect submarines, gather data from underwater sensors that monitor the environment, coral reefs, and fish. The main limitation such waves face is in bandwidth or data rate. Their propagation distance is heavily dependent on frequency, and if you want to transmit to a far distance of about 100 kilometers, your frequency sharply drops to about 2 kilohertz, which gives you a very small data rate, and you're not able to send high-speed data. Acoustic signals do not penetrate through the air-water boundary, which means that they simply reflect off of the sea surface back down, which creates multiple different paths, signal interference that can cause delays and noise. In addition to that, there are many other sources of noise underwater, such as ambient noises from earthquakes and the flow of water, up until fish noise from whales and dolphins communications, and also human activity from shipping and wind farms. With a speed of signal of about 1500 meters per second, they're highly susceptible to Doppler effect. Despite many of the challenges mentioned, acoustic communications remains the main mode of underwater wireless communications, since they can allow propagation to very high distances without much attenuation. Albeit they don't have very high data rates. Currently, most of the research is happening specifically in acoustic communications, since they're the most promising ones. With new transducer designs and signal processing techniques, we're pushing them further and further on the bandwidth they can reach and the distances, making them even more useful. Underwater wireless communications is one of the most important technologies for us to explore one of the most challenging environments on Earth, the deep sea and ocean. No matter the mode, radio frequency, optical, or acoustic, they all have their pros and cons. While acoustic waves can reach very far distances, they also are not very fast. Optical communications will help with that, however, they only propagate on about tens of meters. Radio frequency communications are quite literally no good, which is why we're dealing with other modes, and we're currently exploring how to make more of them when we combine them. Next time you're frustrated with your slow internet, just remember that at least you're not trying to stream Netflix from a submarine. And thank you for watching.